Most Star Wars fans have some level of familiarity with the 7 forms of lightsaber combat, the primary fighting styles of the Jedi. But there's a difference between knowing the fundamentals of a combat form, or even knowing its moves, and understanding it. The 7 forms weren't just mechanical sequences of stances and attacks, but complex combat philosophies. To understand the forms, one must first explore their philosophical groundings. In this new series, we'll be doing exactly that, starting with Form 1, Shii-Cho. Shii-Cho emerged during a time of transition for the Jedi Order. For millennia, the Jedi had used alchemically enhanced swords strong in the Force, but somewhere between 10,000 and 8,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, they started using new weapons, proto-sabers. The first of these early lightsabers were unstable and clunky. They were unsuitable for combat and served a purely ceremonial role. But as technology advanced, proto-sabers became a viable weapon, and before long, they surpassed Force-imbued swords. Shii-Cho was born out of this transition, and this was evident in both the form and its guiding philosophy. Much of Form 1 was adapted from traditional swordplay, but overall, it was much more deliberate and cautious. The Jedi Masters who invented the combat style were uncertain about the potential and reliability of their proto-sabers, and as a result, Shii-Cho was characterized by broad, sweeping strokes and a simple set of repetitive maneuvers. The form was a prototype, and it simply meant that, when other lightsaber forms came about, Shii-Cho was largely relegated as a training form. It was an ideal introduction to lightsaber combat and easy to grasp, though it was hard to master. Above all, Shii-Cho was a form of determination and persistence, which was why it was called the determination form. It was also known as the way of the Sarlacc because Shii-Cho required Jedi to be patient, like a Sarlacc waiting for its meal. Originally, this was probably due to the temperamental nature of early proto-sabers, with which Jedi needed to be patient or risk self-injury. This caution defined Shii-Cho, though it could be hard to detect in the movements of true Form 1 masters.
It is simple, and its simplicity is strength. It allows focus, a slightly improved chance of connecting with one's opponent. It has no other advantages or disadvantages. It is an effective form to fall back on when no other form will do.
Shii-Cho was extremely deliberate. In its raw form, it relied on only a handful of basic sweeping strokes, all at either 90-degree or 45-degree angles. All other moves within Form 1 were just variations on these basic strokes. Offense and defense were essentially the same within Form 1. The same strokes were used for both. This made lightsaber-to-lightsaber combat with raw Shii-Cho extremely basic, as you'd expect from a form that predated the existence of lightsaber-wielding Darksiders. During Form 1 combat drills, Jedi younglings were paired up, with one student given the role of defender and the other attacker. The latter would attack with Shii-Cho's basic strokes, attempting to push the other back, while the former would block with perpendicular strokes, trying to not lose any ground. At random intervals, the overseeing masters would order the students to switch roles. This changed the direction and flow of combat, but nothing else. Within Shii-Cho, combat was all the same. Because of its limited set of moves, Shii-Cho relied less on fancy blade work and more on continuous motion. Form 1 practitioners pushed forward as much as they could, relentlessly forcing their opponents to retreat until they were pressed into a corner. The form's goal was not to overpower an opponent, but rather to outlast them through greater control, greater willpower, and greater strength in the Force. In a sense, Shii-Cho wasn't actually about lightsabers at all. It was a form of combat discipline, a mindset fueled by determination. Shii-Cho was particularly useful for Jedi fighting multiple opponents. Its broad strokes fell short when fighting single opponents with plenty of mobility, but it could turn the tide in a more uneven fight. It taught its practitioners to manage their opponents, as its strokes were wide and usually overhand and made it difficult for opponents to spread out. Shii-Cho users forced their opponents into a more manageable box directly in front of them where they couldn't flank the duelist. The masters of Form 1 applied this philosophy to their everyday lives as well as lightsaber combat, managing whatever challenges they faced in the same way they would a group of thugs. The training velocities in which Jedi initiates practiced Form 1 only ended when the instructor gave the order, But out in the real world, Shii-Cho practitioners had to end their battles on their own terms. Traditionally, Shii-Cho users ended their duels with a move called Sun Djem, or a disarming slash. This maneuver was quite simple and involved either destroying an opponent's weapon with a precise slash or just bashing it out their hands. True to Form 1, this maneuver was a more precise yet more heavy-handed variation of one of the more basic Shii-Cho strokes. Shii-Cho generally taught its users to avoid killing or even maiming their opponents, though this wasn't a hard rule. Looking at the raw, inelegant slashes and parries of Form 1, you might think that its experimental origin and ties to traditional swordplay were all that defined Shii-Cho. But if so, you'd be wrong. As we said earlier, the Jedi Masters who first conceived of Shii-Cho drew on what they knew to craft the form, and what they knew wasn't just traditional swordplay. Shii-Cho was also deeply rooted in the philosophy of the light side, and since it was designed to be practiced by Force users, it was patterned after a concept that any Jedi would be familiar with: the ebb and flow of the Force. To explain what we mean, let's consider the following passage from the Revenge of the Sith novelization. This is Obi-Wan Kenobi in the light. He doesn't even need to reach into the Force. He has already let the Force reach into him. The Force flows over him and around him as though he's stepped into a crystal pure waterfall lost in the green coils of a forgotten rainforest. When he opens himself up to that sparkling stream, it flows into him and through him and out without the slightest interference from his conscious will. The part of him that calls himself Obi-Wan Kenobi is no more than a ripple, an eddy in the pool into which he endlessly pours. There are other parts of him here as well. There's nothing here that is not part of him. From the scuff mark on R2-D2's dome to the tattered hem of Palpatine's robe, from the spidering crack in one transparasteel panel of the curving view wall above to the great starships that still battle beyond it. Because this is all part of the Force. This was what use of the light side was like, though it usually wasn't as pronounced as this scene suggested. This sense of the Force was why Shii-Cho used identical patterns for defense and offense, and why it emphasized disarming instead of destroying. Because its creators and users became one with the Force in combat, and in the Force, all things were one. Furthermore, the very strokes and parries used in Form 1 were meant to invoke this feeling. When practiced by a true master of the form, Shii-Cho's movements were extremely fluid, appearing to an observer like flowing water. In this advanced style of Shii-Cho, it was nigh impossible to tell where one move ended and another began. This was possible because of Shii-Cho's greatest strength, its simplicity. It broke down combat to simple, fluid motions, both of the lightsaber and of the duelist's body. Even though its moves were broad and repetitive, Shii-Cho allowed for a surprising amount of variability. Since it was so simple, users could easily transition from one move to another. The blade work of Shii-Cho masters was wild but controlled, random but fluid, and unquestionably effective. The philosophy of Shii-Cho is best surmised as a rejection of complicated maneuvers, a breaking down of the universe to its basics. Complicated structures were illusionary because the great stream of the Force flowed through all things, and in the Force, everything was simple, the same basic structure expressed in infinitely different ways. Shii-Cho sought to ride the current of the Force instead of trying to tame it, to embrace its most fundamental aspects and imitate its flow. This made true Shii-Cho, the Form 1 of the Jedi Masters, difficult to control, but also powerful in the right hands. That's one form down, 6 more to go. Now it's time to tackle the antithesis of Shii-Cho, Form 2, also known as Makashi. Where Form 1 was simple and characterized by patience and determination, Form 2 was one of the most complex lightsaber styles, founded in a philosophy of precision, economy, and contention. Makashi was the favored style of the likes of Count Dooku and Shaak Ti, and tonight we'll be exploring what made it so effective. When we discussed Form 1, we mentioned that it was designed before lightsaber combat was really a thing, and as such, could be unsuitable for lightsaber duels. Form 2 was the opposite, invented specifically for lightsaber duels. It came about during the 100-Year Darkness, the century-long war between the Jedi Order and an army of Dark Jedi schismatics, the future founders of the Sith Order. In those days, lightsaber duels, or proto-saber duels more specifically, were commonplace. At first, many were fought in the Shii-Cho style as there was no alternative, so Makashi was developed specifically to counter it. Where Form 1 relied on broad sweeps, formulaic attacks and simple persistence, Form 2 was an extremely precise style meant to completely dismantle the Shii-Cho formula. It was fairly similar to traditional fencing, emphasizing conservation of energy, quick stabs and careful footwork. It was an open challenge to the Dark Jedi and their single-minded fury, a display of cold, reasoned precision that sharply contrasted the rage-fueled, nigh unhinged dark side perversion of Shii-Cho. The Dark Jedi claimed that their power came from their rage, from the wild, untamed strength they put into lightsaber duels, but Makashi turned this strength into weakness, allowing Jedi to shatter their opponent's guards and strike them down with ease. In a sense, it was a demonstration that the chaos of the dark side could never overcome the clarity granted by the light. Makashi was also known as the contention form or way of the Salamiri, with the latter name referring to the famed force resistance lizards of Wayland, known for their tenacity in combat. It bore the marks of an era when the Jedi just didn't have time for patient, deliberate movements or overwhelmingly defensive combat. In the 100-Year Darkness, Jedi had to strike hard, strike fast, and strike carefully. It was popular in eras when such a methodology was needed, notably during wars, and tended to fade into obscurity during times of peace. After the end of the 100-Year Darkness, it lost popularity due to the emergence of other combat forms, only to see slight resurgences during the various Sith Wars. Aside from the 100-Year Darkness, the peak of Makashi was the New Sith Wars, a 1,000-year period of intermittent war with various Sith factions. By the time of the Clone Wars, however, it was fairly obscure.
A technique that helps one resist the force attacks of an enemy and also is excellent in lightsaber combat. It does more damage, but it leaves you vulnerable to other attacks. Use it against others wielding the force or lightsabers, but not against anyone else.
The foundation of Makashi was footwork. Makashi footwork typically followed a straight line, both for offense and defense, moving forwards and backwards while maintaining balance. The purpose of this was to keep the user steady, and masters of Makashi were famed for never losing their balance unless whatever they were standing on shifted or gave way. Balance, both physically and philosophically, was a major component of Makashi, though we'll get into that later. Unlike Shii-Cho, Makashi treated defense and offense a bit differently, though according to a similar method. A Makashi defense focused more on redirection than parrying. Riposts, maneuvers in which a duelist would shunt the enemy's blade aside and then follow up with an attack, were a favorite of Makashi duelists. Especially against Shii-Cho practitioners, Makashi duelists would essentially catch their opponent's blade and then calmly brush it off to the side, redirecting the kinetic force of the blow instead of absorbing it. Of course, this was only so effective. Makashi duelists often struggled against extremely strong opponents or Form 5 duelists, against whom such redirection was very challenging. Makashi was also generally unsuited for use against multiple opponents or blaster-wielding foes, as its defensive principles were a bit less practical in these situations. However, Makashi was extremely effective against disarmament. Its users held their sabers tight, but not too tight, making them difficult to dislodge from the hand. This was meant as a direct counter to the disarming sweeps of Form 1. The Makashi offense was much more aggressive. It generally eschewed broad strokes and precise angles, favoring jabs, feints, and precise strikes in favor of the more unwieldy maneuvers of Form 1. Form 2 was extremely fluid, emphasizing adaptability to overcome the tedious formularity of Shii-Cho. Makashi practitioners tended to hyper-focus on one opponent at a time, taking careful note of every shortcoming in their defense before moving, either figuratively or literally, for the kill. While other duelists might have tried to sever an opponent's limb with a wide slash or chop, Makashi duelists would do so with a quick cut. For Makashi duelists, the preferred marks of contact, or ways to maim or disarm an opponent to end a duel, were Sun Djem and Shiak. Sun Djem, which was also the preferred mark of contact for Shii-Cho duelists, was simple disarmament, though Makashi duelists usually preferred to destroy their opponent's weapon, slice off their fingers, or just slice off their hand instead of batting their opponent's saber away. Shiak, on the other hand, was a quick, precise stab either to one of the limbs or the heart. Both defensive and offensive Makashi were built on the same set of combat principles: precision, balance, fluidity, and economy. All of the first three principles were meant to make combat economical for the duelist to conserve as much energy as possible. The energy of the duelist, both force-based and physical, was quickly exhausted by the unfocused, flashy maneuvers of other forms, but Makashi's precision meant it wasted as little energy as possible. In a sense, even though Makashi was a very complex form with many difficult maneuvers, it had a simplicity to it, encouraging the duelist to do only what they needed to win. If you know anything about Makashi, you know that it was the preferred form of Count Dooku, a form he used even after he became a Sith Lord. Between that and its diametric opposition to Shii-Cho, a form that was an expression of the light side of the Force, you might think Makashi was a little Sithy, or at least dark side adjacent in some way. But that wasn't the case. Makashi, like Shii-Cho, was firmly rooted in the philosophy of the light side, just in a different way. Remember how we said that Makashi was about balance? There was a philosophical dimension to this as well. Form 2 required focus and precision that practically required the user to draw on the Force, and it usually required them to be balanced in the Force, which, in case you haven't seen one of the videos where we harp on about this, meant that the user was a practitioner of the light side. Now, obviously, Darksiders could use Makashi too, but even they had to use their powers in a way that mirrored the light side's stoic calm and unbreakable focus. Strong emotions or even simple aggressive urges were counterproductive with Makashi as they led to less precise movement. Aggressive tactics, which Makashi duelists often favored, didn't necessarily require internal aggression, just a focus on offense. And just as the patience and deliberation of Shii-Cho was rooted in the light side, so too was Makashi's aggression. To use the light side of the Force was to allow the Force to flow through oneself, to act in perfect accord with the will of the Force. Sometimes, the Force called for patience. At other times, opponents needed to be defeated quickly and soundly. Makashi specialists were skilled at doing exactly that, analyzing and piercing the defense of their opponents without any hints of passion. Their aggressive tactics were without aggression, displaying instead cold, stoic resolve. Even Count Dooku, Sith Lord though he was, emphasized Makashi's emotionless, strictly tactical focus. The guiding philosophy of Makashi, in layman's terms, was that duelists shouldn't waste time and energy with flashy moves or wild storms of emotion. Form 2 taught its practitioners to win, and to do so simply, quickly, efficiently, and without emission. It was a philosophy of coolness under pressure, one that accepted the desperate nature of combat and brought order and reason to it. Makashi was how the light side did battle, with a coldness and deadly focus that could easily extinguish the uncontrolled fire of the dark side. That's 2 forms done, 5 more to go. This was by far the most offensive of the 7 forms, favored by the likes of Obi-Wan Kenobi as well as Darth Xena. The basics of its grounding philosophy are fairly simple but quite interesting, so let's dive right in. As with Shii-Cho and Makashi, Soresu was a product of its time. During the 100-Year Darkness, Makashi was the dominant form due to its usefulness in battle against Dark Jedi. After the war's end, however, the last of the Dark Jedi were banished from known space and Makashi fell out of style. While incredibly effective in lightsaber combat, Form 2 just wasn't designed for anything else, poorly suited against blasters and large groups of enemies. But a shift back to Form 1 wouldn't cut it either. Shii-Cho could handle large groups pretty well, though its broad sweeps just weren't practical for blaster deflection. Enter Soresu, or Form 3, which essentially took the parts of Form 1 that were effective for crowd control and combined them with Form 2's precision and economy of motion. The result was the ultimate defensive form. In the hands of a skilled Soresu practitioner, lightsabers became impregnable walls of energy that neither blasters nor other lightsabers could penetrate. It wasn't without weakness, however, especially since it didn't grant the user any true offensive capabilities. For the Jedi's usual peacekeeping duties though, this suited them fine. Yoda once told Luke Skywalker that Jedi use the Force for knowledge or defense, never attack. This principle was rarely adhered to by the old Jedi Order, however. For thousands of years, the Jedi stretched the definitions of defense and peacekeeping to the point where they were used as euphemisms for attack in some scenarios. This was a matter of practicality, as outright pacifism isn't too realistic when your job is to protect the galaxy, but there were still always some Jedi who were uncomfortable with how willing some of their comrades were with aggression. Soresu may have been developed, in part, as a reaction to the aggressive tactics the Jedi came to favor during the 100-Year Darkness, a counterweight to the offensive leanings of Makashi. Soresu was the dominant form among Jedi when they weren't at war, overtaking every other style whenever the Sith retreated into the shadows. By the time of the Clone Wars, it was the most popular form among Jedi of all ranks, especially Jedi Consulars. Form 3 served its adherents well during the Clone Wars, keeping them and their troops safe from enemy fire on countless battlefields.
A defensive technique, but effective. Use it if you do not wish to be hit or if you are facing many opponents with blasters. With a lightsaber blade and enough skill in deflection, it is an excellent defense against blasters, but in other situations, it merely delays the inevitable.
Soresu was also known as the Resilience form or the Way of the Mynock, and its objectives were quite different from its predecessor, Makashi. The aim of Soresu wasn't to win battles, but to survive them. Its users didn't even try to overcome their opponents much of the time, opting to outlast them instead. The efficiency of Form 3 meant that its practitioners could usually conserve their energy for far longer than their assailants, allowing them to wait their opponents out and make their move once they began to slip up. Once this happened, Soresu practitioners would either move to quickly disarm their attackers or talk them into surrender. Soresu involved constant and quick, but still easy, motion of the blade, maintaining a flow somewhat similar to the blade work of Shii-Cho masters. Its goal was to leave as little of the body vulnerable as possible, and it accomplished this by eschewing a reliance on specific stances or maneuvers. Indeed, Soresu was less a set of moves, like Makashi or especially Shii-Cho, and more like an approach to combat, a form of constant defensive motion. Much like Makashi, Soresu emphasized adaptability, especially when it conserved energy. Typically, Soresu practitioners only blocked what they had to and would often dodge bolts or strikes if possible as a way to save energy. Soresu masters, however, could create such a perfect defensive barrier that this was unnecessary and could fight without moving anything but their arms. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Kenobi met every one of Dooku's thrusts without so much as moving his feet, staying perfectly centered, perfectly balanced, blade never moving a millimeter more than necessary, deflecting without effort, riposting with flickering strikes and stabs swifter than the tongue of a Garolian ghost viper. More so than Forms 1 and 2, Soresu relied on the Force. That innate foresight the Force gave its users, that instinct that told Jedi what would happen in the next 5 seconds, was what made the unyielding defense of Form 3 possible. Soresu could be imitated by non-Force sensitives. General Grievous, for example, used computers fused with his brain to think and move extremely quickly while analyzing the attack styles of his enemies, allowing him to predict and block their strikes. But this way was only imitation. True Soresu required foresight and the inner power granted by the Force. Soresu wasn't limited to use by the Jedi. Darth Xana, for example, favored the form as well, as she was too much of a lightweight, physically speaking, to make proper use of more aggressive forms. However, only the Jedi who let the Force take over and guide them in battle could unleash its true potential. To again quote Revenge of the Sith, the electro drivers powering Grievous's mechanical arms let each of the 4 attack thrice in a single second, integrated by combat algorithms in the biodroid's electronic network of peripheral processors. Each of the 12 strikes per second came from a different angle with different speeds and intensity, an unpredictably broken rhythm of slashes, chops and stabs, of which every single one could take Obi-Wan's life. Not one touched him. After all, he had often walked unscathed through hornet swarms of blaster fire, defended only by the Force's direction of his blade. Countering 12 blows per second was only difficult, not impossible. His blade wove an intricate web of angles and curves, never truly fast but always just fast enough. each motion of his lightsaber subtly interfering with 3 or 4 or 8 of the general's strikes, the rest sizzling past him. His precise, minimal shifts of weight and stance slipping them by centimeters. Philosophically speaking, Soresu in the hands of a master could be seen as the Force itself shutting down a fight. Soresu masters let the Force take over and completely neutralize their opponent's attacks, turning the fight into a stalemate that only ended when the attacker accepted the futility of their actions. That was what defined the form, the refusal to start a fight and to weather battles instead of answering aggression with aggression. To practice Soresu was to exist in the eye of the storm, to be calm and unmoved by the turmoil of battle, even in the midst of it. In this sense, Soresu was essentially the embodiment of one of the cornerstones of Jedi philosophy, non-aggression. It's notable that, unlike most other lightsaber forms, Soresu didn't have any finishing moves. Form 3 had an opening salute, which Obi-Wan Kenobi was particularly fond of, but it completely lacked a means of ending a battle. This was not an oversight. While Soresu practitioners could and often did borrow disarming maneuvers from Shii-Cho and Makashi, the idea behind Soresu was to give Jedi an opportunity to end battles peacefully. This may not seem all that practical, but this approach worked often enough, especially in day-to-day fights with petty thugs. Of all the lightsaber forms, Soresu was easily the most Jedi-like. Form 3 taught that there wasn't such a thing as winning a fight, only surviving it, and the more combatants who survived, the better. Unless you're Darth Xanar, of course, in which case it teaches you nothing and you simply use it as a defensive tool while you brew your Sith sorcery. Up to now, our series on lightsaber forms has covered the more basic forms. We've talked about the basics of Shii-Cho, the dual-focus Makashi, and the strictly defensive Soresu. But today, we're going to be moving on to the more complicated forms. Form 4, or Ataru, is best known as the preferred form of Jedi Master Yoda, who used it in combination with the Force to devastating effect. But despite its use by the Jedi Order's most well-known master, Ataru had a dark side to it, as we'll discuss in this video. In the same way Makashi was developed as a counter to Shii-Cho, you can think of Ataru as a counter to Soresu. While Soresu focused on defense and presented no real offensive capabilities, Ataru was overwhelmingly offensive. Unlike the 3 prior forms, its aim was to overwhelm an opponent, usually through sheer momentum. It encouraged practitioners to fight aggressively, to strike from as many angles as possible and quickly wear an opponent out. In this, it relied more than any other form on the use of the Force, which allowed Jedi to use acrobatics to further overwhelm targets. It's not known when or why Form 4 developed. Unlike Makashi or Soresu, it didn't seem to have been conceived in response to any specific historical pressures. Like Makashi, it struggled against multiple enemies and blaster-wielding opponents, but unlike Makashi, it wasn't specifically tailored for lightsaber duels either. It's possible that Ataru developed sometime around the Great Hyperspace War, in which the Jedi came up against Sith who primarily used alchemically enhanced swords, but that's speculative and seems unlikely, as it would mean the remaining lightsaber forms were developed in a much shorter window than their predecessors. Regardless, we would guess that it was developed for use against opponents who fought like Sith of the era, judging by the strengths of the form. The popularity of Ataru waxed and waned, but not as regularly as some of the other forms. During some wars, it was popular among Jedi fighting on the front lines. This was especially true during the Mandalorian Wars, in which the Revanchists used the form to great effect against Mandalorian warriors. During other wars, however, use of the form was discouraged as it was feared that Ataru's aggression would lead its users to the dark side. Ataru wasn't taught to younger Jedi during the New Sith Wars for this same reason. After the end of the New Sith Wars, it became more popular again, and by the time of the Clone Wars, it was actually a favorite of Padawans and young Jedi Knights, contrary to how the Order had treated it a millennium earlier.
This technique is good against a lone opponent, and you will find your critical strikes are more effective, but you will be vulnerable to almost everyone else you are fighting.
Ataru was known as the aggression form or way of the Hawkbat, as its practitioners seemed to mimic the furious, unpredictable attack patterns of those vicious creatures. In fact, one of Ataru's signature maneuvers was named after the Hawkbat swoop, in which the practitioner would deliver a quick strike and then maneuver away before their opponent had a chance to respond. Ataru generally favored those sorts of maneuvers, taking a sort of quantity over quality approach to offense. Form 4 practitioners often didn't strike that hard, but they did strike dizzyingly fast and from every which way. As we mentioned earlier, Ataru was designed to make use of the Force. This was hardly something unique to Ataru. As we mentioned when we talked about Soresu, that form was also heavily reliant on the Force. However, Ataru differed from the other forms in that its practitioners didn't necessarily use the Force for greater clarity or to center themselves. Instead, they used it to enhance their physical capabilities. The most obvious aspect of this was the acrobatics that Ataru masters worked into combat, but Form 4 users drew on the Force in more subtle ways as well. Ataru practitioners called on the Force to make themselves faster, stronger, and more perceptive, all means of overcoming their physical limitations. For this reason, Ataru was often used by Jedi that had greater physical limitations than their peers, including Jedi who were old, small, or in the case of Yoda, both. Ataru emphasized constant movement of the body. In particular, its moves often involved spinning, somersaults, and cartwheels, which, when combined with fast-paced lightsaber strikes, made Form 4 practitioners extremely hard to pin down. These acrobatic movements were involved primarily in offense, intended to keep opponents off balance, but they were useful in defense as well. Ataru, while an aggressive style, was not without defensive capabilities. However, unlike other forms, it taught its users to focus more on physically avoiding opponents' weapons instead of parrying them. This could prove to be a significant weakness if Ataru users found themselves fighting in tight spaces. Even Qui-Gon Jinn, an Ataru master, was easily outmaneuvered and struck down by Darth Maul once forced into a tight space. Ataru's strength, relative to other forms, was its flexibility. While the older forms emphasized careful footwork and straightforward movements, Form 4 encouraged practitioners to maintain constant motion, preferably in unpredictable ways. Ataru was at its best against single opponents in open spaces where the duelist had room to maneuver. It was an effective form for lightsaber duels, and while it struggled against the precision of Makashi, it was much more effective against strength-based combat techniques. As we mentioned when we discussed Makashi, the form didn't do well against strong opponents due to the light strikes inherent to the style. Ataru, on the other hand, was very effective against brute force, as its maneuverability allowed practitioners to run circles around strength-focused opponents while dishing out blows that were just as devastating. So what were the philosophical fundamentals of Ataru? To find our answer, we're going to briefly discuss the form's most well-known user, Master Yoda. With and without his lightsaber, Yoda always used Ataru to the fullest in combat. Even though he was normally a very stoic and peaceful being, when there was fighting to be done, he fought with all the ferocity of a coked-up house cat battling a raccoon, a contrast that some folks have argued ruins his character. But Ataru, while aggressive, wasn't in conflict with Yoda's usual peaceful ways. When we discussed Makashi, we mentioned that there was a difference between aggressive combat and a state of aggression, and the same thing applies here. Ataru, for Yoda, was a last resort. He always tried to avoid combat if possible, and he only pulled out his lightsaber when that ceased to be an option. Yoda made use of Ataru because, if there was fighting to be done, he wanted it to end as quickly as possible. Ataru was a lot like Makashi in that regard. Its aggressive maneuvers weren't necessarily an expression of the user's aggression, but rather a way to quickly and efficiently end combat. Ataru sought this goal in a different way, however. While Makashi relied on precision, Ataru masters relied on the strongest weapon they had in their arsenal, the Force. Ataru, at its most pure, was completely reliant on the Force, with practitioners using it to guide and enhance their every move. There was a bit of danger in this, however. Unlike Makashi, which required a sort of stoic calm, Ataru lended itself very well to powerful, aggressive emotions. It was far more open to the dark side than any of the three previous forms, as its offensive focus and wild maneuvers could be extremely effective when paired with the uncontrolled passion of Darksiders. If Ataru practitioners weren't careful, Form 4 could potentially even lead them to the dark side, encouraging them to surrender to aggression and pour their anger and hate into their strikes. This risk wasn't as pronounced as it was for some other forms, and the dark side was by no means inherent to Ataru, but the danger remained. So that's our look at Ataru, the fourth lightsaber combat form. Form 5, together with Form 4 and Form 3, was one of the most popular forms during the Clone Wars. It was the favourite of many famous Jedi, Ahsoka Tano, Plo Koon and Anakin Skywalker among them. The form had a reputation for being aggressive and strength focused, but the true philosophical underpinnings of Form 5 are far more complex. In this video, we're going to dive right into them. Shien, the primary discipline of Form 5, was developed concurrently with Ataru, likely sometime before the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY. Forms 4 and 5 were similar in a number of ways, notably in their more aggressive tactics. Despite the aggression of the form, however, Shien was actually based on Soresu. While Ataru was a clear departure from the tactics and philosophy of Soresu, Shien was the work of Soresu masters who found the strictly defensive focus of Form 3 inefficient. To improve the form, they looked to Makashi, combining some of its more aggressive tactics with the defensive maneuvers of Form 3. The result was Form 5. In its most simplified form, the philosophy of Form 5 was that the best defense is a good offense. It drew on many of the basics of Soresu, especially the principles of centering oneself in the force, maintaining constant momentum of the blade, and keeping careful balance, and used these principles to attack as well as defend. Indeed, Shien in particular allowed for offense and defense in tandem, encouraging its practitioners to reflect instead of deflect incoming blaster bolts and lightsaber blades, turning an enemy's attack back on them. Form 5's Shien discipline was intended for battles against blaster-wielding opponents, much like Soresu. It was highly effective against multiple opponents, and it could defend the user against incoming blaster bolts almost as effectively as Soresu. Unlike Soresu, however, Shien allowed its users to counterattack while simultaneously defending themselves. Instead of playing defense and waiting for the enemy to create an opening, Shien users created their own openings, attacking while redirecting incoming fire to keep the momentum of the battle in their favor. Djem, the other discipline of Form 5, was made specifically for lightsaber duels, which Shien wasn't really suited for. Djem operated on the same principles of Shien, but was even more aggressive, requiring the user to pour strength into their parries and counterattacks. Skilled Djem practitioners could beat the blades of their enemies back toward them while mixing in heavy-handed attacks of their own. Even more so than with Shien, momentum was focal to Djem. Practitioners of this form almost never let up, constantly on the offensive.
An aggressive technique, but it is powerful, effective. It can counter blaster weapons and add to the damage of your critical.
Form 5 was known as the Perseverance form or the Way of the Krayt Dragon, and those who faced it in combat knew those names were well deserved. No matter what, Form 5 practitioners just kept coming. Surrender was the only guarantee of safety from their lightsabers. The sheer momentum Form 5 generated usually made up for its only real weakness, its lack of mobility. It also made the form popular with many younger Jedi. Some of the Jedi Order's most headstrong members favored the form, from the infamous Ulic Qel-Droma to the Chosen One himself, and it's not hard to see why. Shien was distinguished by its constant, long, sweeping strikes, which were usually heavy-handed and amplified through the Force. Some Shien practitioners, such as Ahsoka Tano, held their lightsabers in a reverse grip to make these sorts of strikes even more powerful, though this was rare and controversial in the Jedi Order. The broad strokes of Shien were meant to intercept and reflect incoming blaster bolts. With the help of the Force, Shien practitioners could plan their strikes to intercept multiple bolts with a single sweep, redirecting some or all back toward attackers. Particularly skilled Shien users could create a barrier of blades that reflected anything coming its way, or they could deflect incoming fire while simultaneously lunging at opponents. Djem was a bit of a different beast, and to do it justice, we're going to turn to the Revenge of the Sith novelization. The first overhand chop of Skywalker's blade slid off Dooku's instinctive guard. The second bent Dooku's wrist. The third flash of blue forced Dooku's scarlet blade so far to the inside that his own lightsaber scorched his shoulder, and Dooku was forced to give ground. Skywalker came on, mechanically inexorable, impossibly powerful, a destroyer droid with a lightsaber. Each step a blow and each blow a step. Dooku backed away as fast as he dared. Skywalker stayed right on top of him. Dooku's breath went short and hard. He no longer tried to block Skywalker's strikes, but only to guide them slanting away. He could not meet Skywalker strength to strength. Gemso practitioners maintained a constant advance, mercilessly beating down on the guard of any opponent within reach. It employed similar motions to Shien, but Gemso's moves were much less broad and usually focused on a single opponent instead of a crowd. This focus often led Gemso practitioners to develop tunnel vision in combat, but it also made them devastatingly effective. Gemso was notorious for its ability to completely dismantle the careful pattern of Makashi due to its focus and utilization of strength. One of Gemso's most iconic maneuvers exemplified the style pretty well. Falling Avalanche, an extraordinarily powerful overhand blow in which the duelist raised their saber over their head and brought it crashing down with all their might. This was devastatingly powerful, but fairly easy to sidestep, much like Gemso in general. Shien and Gemso were markedly different styles, but both were considered Form 5 because they shared the same fundamental combat philosophy: defense through offense. In this sense, Form 5 was very similar to the philosophy of the Jedi Guardians. The Guardians believed that passively defending the innocent was not enough. That true peace required the Jedi to actively battle evil, to seek it out and destroy it. Form 5 took this philosophy and individualized it. It prioritized defeating or destroying attackers over simply shrugging off their attacks, and practitioners of both Form 5 styles were encouraged to keep pressing the offensive until their attackers could no longer cause harm. This was acceptable within the scope of Jedi teachings, but it could be dangerous, much like Guardian philosophy itself. In a video last year, we talked about how Guardians fell to the dark side much more often than Jedi of other sects, in part because of Guardian ideology. Jedi Guardians were at risk of blurring the lines between justice and revenge and straying into ends justify the means territory, and Form 5 could lead its users to a similar way of thinking. The overwhelming force of Form 5, especially Gemso, made it very easy to kill, and Form 5 practitioners had to practice great restraint to avoid killing when it wasn't necessary. The form risked amplifying its users' anger, and as we all know, anger led Force sensitives down a very dark road. But with that said, Form 5 wasn't a dark side form or even a dark side adjacent form. The use of strength or aggressive tactics in combat could lead to the dark side, but they could also work within the framework of the light side. As we mentioned earlier, the only guarantee of safety against the devastating power of Form 5 was surrender, and that was essentially the whole purpose of the form. In completely dominating their opponents, Form 5 practitioners encouraged them to give up sooner than, say, Form 3 would. Ironically, it could put an end to a conflict more quickly and potentially more peacefully than the more defense-oriented forms. So that's our look at Shien and Gemso, the two styles of Form 5. This form, known as Niman, was best described as a hybridization of all 5 prior forms, incorporating elements of each as well as influences from more exotic non-lightsaber combat forms. This made it the least distinctive of the 7 forms, a combat style lacking in both great strengths and great weaknesses. But at the same time, it was perhaps the most fascinating style of lightsaber combat. In this video, we'll be exploring what made it so unique. Niman got its name from a sword fighting style developed by the Royal Macheteros, the bodyguards of the planet Kashyyy's ruling dynasty. This elaborate and deadly fighting technique centered around the use of dual blades, promoting balance, precision, and speed. 24,500 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Niman style was adopted by the Legends of Leto, a sect of Dark Jedi schismatics led by the renunciate Zendor. The Legions of Leto were vanquished by the Jedi Order, but their use of Niman brought the style to the Jedi's attention, and after the war with Zendor, many Jedi began using Niman. For nearly 20,000 years, Jedi swordmasters used Niman to deadly effect, with some continuing to use it long after lightsabers replaced the Force-enhanced swords used in Zendor's day. The persistence of this unique combat style led to its incorporation into the 6th form of lightsaber combat, which was named, appropriately, Niman. This lightsaber form was likely developed shortly after the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, following which the Jedi switched from power pack dependent proto-sabers to modern lightsabers. The switch to conventional lightsabers caused a number of changes for lightsaber combat, opening the door to things such as throwing lightsabers and dual wielding. Niman was designed to accommodate exactly those sorts of maneuvers, building on its Kashi origins to allow for more efficient dual blade action. On top of classical Niman and newer lightsaber techniques, Form 6 incorporated elements of all the prior lightsaber forms except for Makashi. It adopted the power blows of Form 5, the fast-paced action of Form 4, the defensive motions of Form 3, and the broad strokes of Form 1, creating a form that was largely without strengths, weaknesses, or identity. It was designed to accommodate the use of dual blades and more unconventional lightsaber variants, and emphasized offensive uses of the Force in combat, allowing for quick Force pushes or pulls without interrupting the blade work. All told, Niman was an incredibly balanced combat style.
A blending of younger forms, and all of them in moderation. In the blending, much of the individuality is lost, but the strengths are spread evenly, and there is little weakness in it. Its great strength is the way it allows the Force to flow through you, revitalizing one, even in the middle of combat.
Also known as the Way of the Rancor, the Moderation form, and the Diplomat's form, Niman had a much more relaxed focus on blade work than any of the other styles. In Niman, the exact movements of combat weren't what was important, but rather maintaining balance and moderation. This meant that Niman, in its most basic form, was the easiest lightsaber form to get the hang of, making it ideal for Jedi who devoted a relatively small portion of their studies to combat. Properly mastering Niman was much harder though. Sin Dralik, the Jedi Order's battle master during the Clone Wars, estimated that it took over a decade of study to truly master the form. To make the most of Niman, one had to understand the manifold elements of the form without letting any of them feature too prominently in their blade work. Niman masters had to learn how to create a strong defense without sacrificing offense, how to be quick and mobile without sacrificing stability and resilience. This balancing act was what made Form 6 so ideal for dual blades or saber staffs. The use of multiple blades, a technique the Jedi called Jarkai, wasn't exclusive to Niman and could be incorporated into any form. Famed Jarkai duelist Asajj Ventress, for example, was a Makashi stylist, while Darth Maul preferred the Juyo variant of Form 7. However, Niman made Jarkai easy to master and was part of how most Jedi learned to use dual blades. Niman masters also had to balance the various aspects of lightsaber combat with other combat techniques, especially the use of the Force. Many lightsaber forms relied on the Force in some way. We've already discussed how Form 3 relied on Force-based precognition to form an impermeable defense, how Ataru practitioners used the Force to enhance their mobility, and how Djem encouraged the use of the Force to reinforce power blows. But Niman was the only lightsaber form that made active use of more direct, telekinetic applications of the Force. While other lightsaber forms focused solely on the use of the blade to their detriment, Niman stylists knew the Force could be just as effective a weapon as any lightsaber. Jedi practicing Form 6 would use the Force to contain and restrict their opponents, while Sith practicing the form could telekinetically crush their enemies without breaking the rhythm of their blade work. Two common Niman moves were Draw Closer and Pushing Slash, moves that, in true Form 6 style, were essentially opposites. Draw Closer involved telekinetically pulling opponents into the path of one's lightsaber, while Pushing Slash involved scoring a hit on an opponent and then force pushing them out of the fight. Earlier, we described Niman as a form without strengths or weaknesses, a jack of all trades, master of none. Many characters in universe echoed that sentiment, but in truth, Niman did have one unique strength. It was a blank slate, a combat style with no identity of its own, and this allowed users to project their own identities onto the form. Form 6 was a conduit, reflecting the sensibilities and attitudes of its users. Niman allowed its masters to utilize their strengths to the fullest. What they got out of the form was what they put into it. By the time of the Clone Wars, Niman was quite popular among the Jedi, but it had few masters. Most of the Jedi who focused on Niman were consulars, Jedi who preferred meditation, diplomacy, and academic work to lightsaber combat. In their hands, Niman was passive and reserved, with such Jedi using their lightsabers mostly to guard against distractions where they prioritized the use of the Force. This style of Niman wasn't suited for open combat, but it was highly effective in situations where de-escalation and a peaceful resolution were of paramount importance. But Jedi Consulars weren't the only ones to use Niman. Form 6 was actually the favoured style of two of the galaxy's most notorious Sith Lords, Exar Kun and Darth Revan. In Revan's hands, Niman could be anything. In lightsaber duels, the enigmatic Dark Lord would put on a stunning display of acrobatics and aggression in one moment and adopt an unmoving, unyielding defense in the next, rapidly adapting his style to match the situation. 4,000 years after Revan, General Grievous used Niman much to the same way. Exar Kun, meanwhile, took Niman and turned it into an outlet for his raw power. Kun was one of the greatest Sith Lords of all time. Even as a Jedi, he was aggressive and unrelenting in lightsaber combat. Through study of Niman, he became a master of Jarkai, which served him well after he built the galaxy's first double-bladed lightsaber. One would think that Exar Kun's aggression would have been better channeled into Ataru or Djem, but Niman gave Kun an outlet for his power without sacrificing defense, making him nigh invincible in the heat of combat. After he became the Dark Lord of the Sith, no one ever defeated him in lightsaber combat. Even the legendary Jedi weapons master, Vodo Siosk Bask, who had trained Kun, perished when he challenged the Dark Lord. Niman was a mirror. For those Jedi who preferred to avoid combat, it served as a crutch. For the truly gifted masters of the form, it amplified all of their strengths. In the right duelist's hands, it was one of the most powerful lightsaber forms in use, second only to Form 7. Of the 7 forms of lightsaber combat, none commanded nearly as much mystique as Form 7. The youngest of the classical forms, many Jedi considered Form 7 dangerous, and for good reason. This form led its users perilously close to the dark side, especially its Vaapad variant, a technique invented by Mace Windu. Form 7 was also one of the most complex forms, especially in a philosophical sense. In other words, it's perfect for the finale of our series on the philosophy of lightsaber combat. The original Form 7 variant, Juyo, came about in the centuries before the Old Sith Wars, likely between 5000 and 4000 BBY. It was a form unlike any other practiced by the Jedi, an overwhelmingly aggressive and chaotic form. Its practitioners surrendered themselves to the currents of the Force as they were churned up by battle, letting the energy of the fight flow through them and guide their actions. This made Juyo rather difficult. Indeed, most Jedi considered it the most difficult to master of all the 7 forms. It also made Juyo dangerous. Millennia after the creation of Juyo, Mace Windu, with assistance from fellow Jedi Master and Juyo stylist Sora Bulk, formulated another Form 7 variant. This style, Vaapad, was named after a vicious and extraordinarily agile predator from the moons of Sarapin. Vaapad was even more chaotic than Juyo and much more dangerous, as Vaapad drew on the duelist's darker emotions, bringing them close to the dark side. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Vaapad is as aggressive and powerful as its namesake, but its power comes at great risk. Immersion in Vaapad opens the gates that restrain one's inner darkness. To use Vaapad, a Jedi must allow himself to enjoy the fight. He must give himself over to the thrill of battle, the rush of winning. Vaapad is a path that leads through the penumbra of the dark side. Because of this danger and the difficulty in mastering both forms, Form 7 was rare among the Jedi. During the Old Sith Wars, only the greatest of Jedi Masters knew Juyo. It became a bit more popular in the later New Sith Wars, but this ultimately led to disaster, as the rush of Juyo drew many of the Jedi fighting in the war to the dark side. After the end of the New Sith Wars, Juyo became a restricted technique, taught only to a handful of students who were personally selected by the Jedi Battlemaster. Vaapad, when it was developed, was mastered only by Mace Windu and taught to only Sora Bulk and Depa Billaba. Vaapad ended up being too much for either Jedi to handle. It drew both Bulk and Balaba to the dark side during the Clone Wars, much as Juyo had done to its users during the New Sith Wars. This trend was apparent in Form 7 from very early on, when Juyo's most well-known Old Sith Wars era master, the Jedi historian Atris, was also consumed by the dark side.
Perhaps one of the greatest styles, learned only by the most skilled of Force wielders. Impressive. In many ways, some have described it as a surrender to the Force and to chaos, to strike at an opponent with such speed and angles of attack that they have difficulty countering it. Your number of attacks will increase, and you will notice many more of them shall slip beneath an opponent's guard, critically wounding them. But in surrendering yourself to the Force in such a way reduces your ability to resist its effects should the enemy turn the Force against you. Be on your guard.
Form 7 was also known as the Ferocity form and the Way of the Vornskir, the latter referring to a hound-like predator that hunted using the Force. Its blade work bore a vague resemblance to Shii-Cho, involving lots of broad, sweeping strokes. However, while Shii-Cho was rigid and simplistic, Form 7 was chaos, dominated by quick, aggressive strikes and what Battlemaster Sindralig called seemingly unconnected staccato sequences. Its erratic nature made it unpredictable and devastating in combat. But like all lightsaber forms, Form 7 wasn't just a set of maneuvers and tricks, it was a philosophy, a mindset. This was more true for Form 7 than for any other form. The Juyo variant of Form 7 was a little more refined than Vaapad. Its power was drawn from the flow of battle, from the Force in its wildest and most dangerous state. Much like Soresu, true Juyo required the practitioner to open themselves up to the Force. But while Soresu was decidedly rooted in light side techniques, Juyo opened the user up to the Force in whatever form it assumed. In battle, combatants poured all sorts of wild and unpredictable emotions into the Force and altered the shape of the Force in the moment, causing it to change to reflect the frenzy of battle. While other lightsaber forms shut this chaos out, Juyo absorbed it. Vaapad was a bit more personal. It drew on the duelist's personal dark side, feeding on their barely controlled passion and the thrill of battle, which was usually forbidden by the Jedi Code. It also drew on opponents' emotions, drawing in their strength and turning it against them. Vaapad granted its users even more power and unpredictability than Juyo, though this came at the cost of straying even closer to the dark side. Additionally, Vaapad weaponized the Force itself. While Juyo exploited how battle could warp the Force, Vaapad deliberately created this effect, allowing the duelist to draw power from it. To again quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Windu and Palpatine's blades flashed and flared, crashing together with bursts of fire, weaving nets of killing energy in exchanges so fast Anakin could not truly see them, but he could feel them in the Force. The Force itself roiled and burst and crashed around them, boiling with power and lightspeed ricochets of lethal intent. And it was darkening. Anakin could feel how the Force fed upon Palpatine's murderous exultation. He could feel fury spray into the Force as though some poisonous abscess had crested in both their hearts. There was no Jedi restraint here. Mace Windu was cutting loose. As Form 7 came close to the dark side too often, it's worth asking why the Jedi tolerated it in the first place. Vaapad in particular violated the Jedi Code, allowing passion to guide its users' actions. However, the Jedi allowed it because, even though it violated the code and stepped close to the dark side, it wasn't inherently a dark side technique. Juyo could be used as a dark side combat style, and many Darksiders did indeed favor it, Darth Maul among them, but one couldn't elevate Vaapad to its highest form by drawing on the dark side, though Sora Bulk's dark side perversion of the form came pretty close to matching Windu's style. This is because, to quote Revenge of the Sith one last time, Vaapad was a channel for darkness, and that darkness flowed both ways. Windu accepted the furious speed of the Sith Lord, drew the Shadow's rage and power into his innermost center, and let it fountain out again. He reflected the fury upon its source as a lightsaber redirects a blaster bolt. He was not afraid. The darkness had no power over him, but neither did he have power over it. Vaapad made him an open channel, half of a superconducting loop completed by the shadow. It was a state of mind, a channel for darkness. Power passed into him and out again without him touching it. If you're particularly attentive, you might have noticed that this description has strong parallels to the novelization's earlier descriptions of using the light side. Lightsiders open themselves up to the Force, letting it flow through them and direct their actions without interference from their conscious will, in contrast to Darksiders who tried to seize control of the Force and impose their own will upon it. Vaapad users treated the darkness put out by their opponents as they would the light side, turning their enemy's own darkness against them, all without allowing themselves to actually touch the darkness. This was an extraordinarily difficult balance to maintain. When Jedi opened themselves to the rush of battle, as Vaapad required, they were often tempted to draw on the darkness flowing from their opponents instead of redirecting it back at them. It was this temptation that drew Sora Bulk, the style's co-creator, to the dark side during the Clone Wars. By drawing on an opponent's power in this way, Bulk claimed he had perfected Vaapad. In reality, he had lost what made the form so effective, which ultimately led to his defeat. This wraps up our series on the 7 forms of lightsaber combat. If you've been watching from the start, congratulations on making it through. Now that you're more familiar with the 7 forms, which of them is your favorite? If you were a Jedi, which one would you use? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video, or series, or whatever we decide to do next.